everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Victoria de Grazia, presenting her new book, The Perfect Fascist, a story of love, power, and morality in Mussolini's Italy, in conversation with Ruth Ben-Ghiat. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. Just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of The Perfect Fascist on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. We thank you so much for showing up and for tuning in support of our authors and of the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings recently, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now I am delighted to introduce our speakers. Victoria de Grazia is Moore Collegiate Professor of History at Columbia University and a founding editor of Radical History Review. Her widely translated prize-winning books include Irresistible Empire, America's Advance Through 20th Century Europe, and How Fascism Ruled Women. She has received the Woodrow Wilson, Jean Monnet, and Guggenheim Fellowships and the Rome Prize Fellowship from the American Academy in Rome. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is Professor of History and Italian Studies at New York University. She is an internationally renowned historian and commentator on fascism, authoritarian leaders, propaganda, and threats to democracy in America and around the world. She writes frequently for CNN, The Washington Post, and other outlets. Her latest book is Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. Tonight, they'll be discussing Professor de Grazia's new book, The Perfect Fascist, a story of love, power, and morality in Mussolini's Italy. The Perfect Fascist traces the rise and fall of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime through the life of Attilio Teruzzi, a decorated military officer who became a deputy in Mussolini's National Fascist Party. Teruzzi married Liliana Weinman, a rising young Jewish-American opera star, in a carefully stage-managed wedding blessed by Mussolini himself. Teruzzi renounced his wife just 3 years later after he was promoted to commander of the Black Shirts. The proceedings took an ominous turn when Mussolini joined Hitler and fascist Italy introduced its first race laws. Journalist and biographer Sonia Purnell observes of the book, with lyrical precision, Victoria de Grazia's The Perfect Fascist reveals how ideology corrupts the truth, how untrammeled ambition destroys the soul, and how the vanity of white male supremacy distorts emotion, making even love a matter of state. De Grazia sheds welcome light on the mystery of why some women who practically always lose out also sign up. And now I'm honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Victoria and Ruth.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, this is in effect the launch of my book, without the champagne bottles breaking on ship hulls or dancing in the streets and the other festivities I had looked so much forward to celebrating the publication. Now, a colleague of mine wanted to commiserate with me, saying how unfortunate it was that with COVID hogging all the news and preventing gatherings, it would be very hard to communicate about my book on fascism. And I thought, good gracious, how would it be if there were fascism hogging all the news and preventing gatherings? We wouldn't be able to communicate about fascism, much less about COVID. Now, these are very hard and odd times, and I'm very grateful that you've been able to join me this evening. I thank Harvard Bookstore for that, Nell and her staff, Harvard University's press publicity director, Sonia Bonchek, and especially Joy DeMenil, my editor at Harvard, the director of the Belknap Press. I also wanted to sort of send out a thank you to the Yaffe and Landau families, some of whom are listening, whose trove of memorabilia and papers from their late relative, Liliana Weinman, one of the protagonists, gave the first impetus to this book. And I want to thank also Ruth, who's just finished all of her final editing for her own book on Strongmen, which is due out in November, a grim month. Now, this book is about a man. It's about a figure, one of those little men of the early 20th century who rose very high in power. Whom I've called, in a paradoxical way, the perfect fascist. It's about his family, his duce, his cronies. It's a story of him and his women and his friends. And he had lots and lots of them. It is also a history of fascist rule in Italy. It's also a history of Italy and its empire under fascism. We want to keep those distinctions clear. And also about what fascism meant in its time. Okay? We can talk about what fascist means, about what it meant in its historical period. That is from 1920 roughly to 1945. In that sense, it is about love, about all of the affectivity. It's a lot about power, but it's also about morality and about moral order, a problem that historians have a great deal of problems dealing with, yet comes back up again and again, implicitly, if not explicitly, whenever we think about what fascism is. Now, this history began with a marriage, or better, with questions about a marriage. Why did cousin Liliana, distant cousin Liliana, so gifted, such a young, cosmopolitan, educated protege of the Jewish bourgeoisie of early 20th century New York, why did she marry that old fascist with the big beard, 17 years her senior? And why did they separate? Was it because of anti-Semitism? So these questions got me going and then turned ineluctably, inevitably into the questions that historians pose as they get deeper and deeper. Let me start then with that moment of marriage, okay, the wedding, the fascist wedding as I reconstructed it, and go from there, okay, reading from the prologue of the book, which has many of the themes, the leitmotifs, right? So when Benito Mussolini welcomed Attilio Teruzzi into his office at Palazzo Venezia on March 17, 1926, hugged him, teased him about his upcoming marriage, and flirted with his attractive American fiancée, it was a private moment with a public purpose. This was the first time that Mussolini, in his double capacity as president of the Council of Ministers and Duce of Fascism, had been asked to bless a marriage. He was touched. "I am happy you are marrying an American," he told Teruzzi. "English women are ugly, French women perverse, Spanish women bring us bad luck, and we get along with America. There are also a few dollars there, which doesn't hurt." Now, in sum, he heartily approved. At the time, Teruzzi, a one-time career military officer, was Undersecretary of the Ministry of the Interior and a rising star in the fascist establishment. His fiancée, Liliana Weinman, a rising opera diva known by her stage name, Liliana Lorma, who was leaving her calling to marry. The couple was in love, idealistic, and eager to promote Teruzzi's political career. But as the June date approached, they were faced with a predicament. They wanted this union to express Mussolini's latest dictum, 1925, all within the state, and nothing outside of the state, nothing against the state. And there was no protocol for a fascist wedding. They went ahead. No expense was spared. The dollar was strong, and the bride's father, elastic webbing factory in Manhattan's Lower East Side, was booming. He would pay for everything, settle a rich allowance on his daughter, and even outfit the groom's family, all good and humble people. The wedding affair would be a true affair of state, with cabinet ministers and the whole fascist ground council in attendance. Mussolini would be a best man. The ambassador, American ambassador, would be a best man. Tullio Serafin, her mentor, now of the Metropolitan Opera, was going to be another of the witnesses. There would be a prenuptial reception for 400, maybe 500 guests, which would be exquisitely bon ton, with a string quintet, cocktails, and masses of flowers. And in a nod to Mussolini's recent rapprochement with the Vatican, the couple decided that they would hold a church wedding, as well as a civil ceremony. That would need the Pope's dispensation, as the bride, being of the Jewish faith, was an infidel in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And so the wedding took place. June of what it was then being called the year 4 of the fascist era could not have offered more propitious timing for this event. With the first unruly years behind him, normalization was now the byword of Mussolini's regime. Instead of unleashing bands of squadristi to break the opposition, Mussolini used the law to muzzle the press, issued emergency legislation to establish a one-party state, took steps to regularize the fascist militia into a national guard, and set up special military tribunals with provisions for capital punishment to silence dangerous political opposition. Normalization that meant that Italy would return to the capital markets by settling on a schedule for paying its war debts to the United States, by outlawing opposition unions, imposing budget austerity, and slashing worker wages. It also meant that Mussolini hoped to gain respect from bourgeois society by embracing good values like church marriage, by licensing brothels to get prostitutes off the street, and imposing a bachelor tax on celibate men so that they would do their duty to the nation, marry and have children. And at the time, the fact that Attilio Teruzzi, the notorious rowdy, was settling down with a bride of such uncommon talent was, from the perspective of the many women who had welcomed fascism and so far gotten nothing for it, a wholly positive sign. And so their nuptials became what the New York Times called a fascist wedding. Okay? Instead of the usual monogrammed white card, the wedding invitation was engraved with cherubs tying a love knot between the American stars and stripes and the fascist axe and lictors. Instead of a military guard with raised daggers, a troop of fascist Boy Scouts was stationed at the church exit to shout hip hip hooray and sing Giovinezza. Okay. Now, 3 years later, in March 1929, just as Mussolini named him national commander of the Black Shirts, Attilio Teruzzi renounced his wife peremptorily and publicly. He said she betrayed him and brought him on dishonor, and he refused to be swayed by her cries of innocence. Italy had no divorce laws, so the only way he was going to dissolve the marriage was to go through the church courts to prove that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. And thus they entered into the aura, the charisma of the church, with all sorts of unfolding events thereafter. Later, when Mussolini was rampaging about demoting childless hierarchs, and Teruzzi tried once again to find love and settle down, he ended up with another attractive, tall, exuberant outsider. She too was Jewish. They had a love child, and a kind of family life ensued. Then the fascist race laws kicked in. This is 1938. And Teruzzi, who had risen to become the minister of Mussolini's African Empire, was faced with a dilemma of having two Jewish wives. One he couldn't divorce, the other he couldn't marry. The status of the second wife and her child would become more and more of an issue as fascist Italy's Nazi allies complained to the Duce that his inner circle was tepid about implementing the final solution, that in 1942. Now, what you can hear here sounds like an opera libretto or a beginning of a screen treatment from Netflix. You know, I wish. But what I'm doing here now as a historian is taking marriage here, the marriage contract, the marriage bond, marriage as an institution, and then using it as a stepping stone to get behind the facade of fascist, what is called fascist totalitarianism. In every society, marriage is a foundational act, whether based on a civil contract or religious vows, no matter the composition of the couple. It's about sex and children and acquiring property and status, about family, reproducing one's lineage, class, or race, about love and friendships, and where to put one's primary loyalties. It lies at the heart of how we think about what is truly valuable in life. So what I've done in this book is to take the marriage of Attilio Teruzzi as a springboard to explore moral life under fascist rule, power relations, and the nature of affectivity. And therefore it explores Mussolini's purpose in conceiving of his movement as a spiritual and ethical revolution. It touches on, I found how much he uses the term love in his speeches, how much he speaks about a politics of the heart, those are his words, in contrast to what he denounced as liberal society's sterile politics of the brain. And in this effort, I hope that I'll be able to convey to you through a narrative, through the context, through understanding this long history, because it ultimately is a history that lasts 20 plus years. What lies behind, if you want, the rather abstract image that we tend, particularly in the United States, to have about how societies are ruled by what we call conventionally illiberal regimes. Some people call tyranny, some people call totalitarianism, in which I'm trying then to contextualize in a specific place, but also, and I will come back to this question, to be able in some way to generalize that we cannot understand these societies in the conventional liberal way, let's say in the way that Hannah Arendt did in a very noble way in her Origins of Totalitarianism, where she spoke of the iron band of total terror, leaving no space for private life. Those were her words. She was mainly speaking about Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, but in fact, excluding Italy, because as they always say, you know, Italians are much too nice to be fascists. I've heard political theorists at one point saying that in the wake of a very fun conference on the Italian welfare state. Once in power, she argued, totalitarianism turned to ideology and terror to subsume ever more isolated individuals into the oneness of the leader. These totalitarians destroyed every capacity for the free expression of moral sentiments. In effect, in her view, they created a heartless political system. In other words, one we almost cannot comprehend because it's the sort of the ultimate void. It's the absolute negation of society. And I want to make a very different kind of argument here by taking us behind the facade of fascist totalitarianism and into the private life and moral compromises of one of its most exemplary foot soldiers. And I show, I believe, that social, affective, and moral needs and choices continue to exist under fascist rule. People are always making choices for better or for worse. And this is very important for us to keep in mind, that politics continued for better, for much worse. We find all the usual good sentiments and values: family devotion, motherhood, faith, fidelity to the cause, duty to the nation, even love. Fascist Italy, we'll come back to this point, was horrible but full of heart. So I'm going to hand things over to Ruth. I know that she has lots of questions about it, having worked in many of the same areas, and particularly around the problem of virility in men and strong men. I can't hear.
All right. Hello? Good. Great. So I'm very happy to be here to discuss this fabulous book. I've learned a lot from Victoria's work for a long time. And really, Victoria, all of your work has examined how power is exercised and how influence can take many forms, from your first book on fascist leisure time organization to your landmark study of fascism in women, to your book on irresistible empire about American consumer culture in Europe. So you've shown us that, you know, even in a dictatorship, it's not all about coercion, and the nuance of your approach and your conclusions is really always been very appreciated. And that all flows into this book very, very seamlessly. Now, that said, that coercion is not the only thing. Teruzzi was really part of the most violent moments of fascism. You know, he was integral to squadrism. He was the liaison between the fascist party and the squads. And I'm really glad that you spend time reconstructing the environment of the squads, because as you mentioned, you know, many people still don't think that fascism was very violent, perhaps because it gets compared to Nazism, and there's not as good an understanding of the immense violence of fascism throughout and the different forms it took. So this was a man who went from squadrism to the militia, which was the way that Mussolini institutionalized the squads, but they were responsible for a lot of atrocities in the colonies and in Italy. And then he's governor of Libya and minister of Italian Africa. So he's at the scene of atrocity after atrocity. And so I'm glad you talk about the concentration camps in Libya and all of that, and how important Libya was to Italian fascism, because that's simply not well known. And how he treated the empire and as his kind of booty, right? He had possession was very important. And there are the nice parallelisms that you draw there. He treated women much the same way. And the violence of the regime was the background and the foreground for, you know, his private life. And his careerism. And I like your formulation where you say that Mussolini and Teruzzi were sexually insatiable cheats. That's a good formulation. So the book is about Teruzzi's relationship with women, but it's just as much about his relationship with Mussolini. And one could argue he was faithful to Mussolini in a way he was never faithful to his women. So the book has a lot of relevance today, also because it's a study of elite leader collaboration. It's a study of authoritarian leader-follower relationships at a very high level. And you mentioned several times that this collaborator, even, you know, someone as high up as Teruzzi, felt that they could partake of the leader's charisma. And, you know, Mussolini's the sun, and they're all rotating around him. And Teruzzi's life, you know, changed according to Mussolini's priorities. And I think all of that is very important to stress for people to understand how authoritarianism really, really works. So my first question is, was being a perfect fascist, was the male-male bond and obeying Mussolini at all times and being loyal to him, was that the primary qualification for being a perfect fascist?
That's a wonderful question. I started out with a very primitive question. Was this man marrying at 38, 39 years old? Was he a violent man? You know, did he actually go out and beat people up? Well, no, that's not possible. 20-year-olds beat people up, not 38-year-olds, not 39-year-olds. And then, you know, working back to see that he was a soldier, and he was a colonial soldier, and they're allowed unusual harshness, including corporal punishment. He was a war hero. He was a very good soldier. He was also fought in World War I when he's a battalion captain, which is the highest risk operation. And he was also the aide-de-camp of a very prominent, very good, very honest, good general. So he had been chosen by this very good general. So in some way you can go back and see that one of the reasons Mussolini chose him was because he had been already an adjutant of the highest level. And that we have to sort of, I kept keeping that in mind. This is not the, the kind of fawning loyalty, whatever it is, but it's also the adjutant's role to take the bullet for the general. I mean, physically they're there, and he would take, physically he is always concealing Mussolini. You can see him in the, in the organization. He's there. He's totally physically trustworthy. So I'm just trying to get this sense of the bond of hierarchy, which is there. So don't think of lapdog, folks, when you think of a figure like this. This is a trained soldier who was an unusual gift to the fascist movement, to get a major to organize your first squads in Milan, and believe that he was really doing a good job so they wouldn't do illegal things without the police working with them, which he was good at, getting the police to work with the squads and everybody coming back in one piece after breaking the heads of workers accused of being illegally armed, usually with stones and sticks. Okay. So, what do you say? The fidelity, but especially that high quality fidelity, was very important to Mussolini, and it was very important in this man's conduct. He's always saying, I'm faithful soldier of the revolution, which has a different meaning from being I'm an opportunist and coming around. But he was also then very subordinate because he had no capital himself. He had no independent role. He his marriage to the rich woman failed. So in a sense, he's like a poor, pathetic guy. He doesn't have a wife to protect him because she was very protective of him and in mediating his relationships. I'm just trying to give you what so he's sometimes called an enforcer or a thug. Now he's a military man with a bad temper, quick to get angry, uses his hands in a movement which thrives on saying we are going to enforce order by creating disorder. He's perfect for that role. And that's what you want in a fascist movement. You cause disorder, then you say, oh my God, call in the police, call in the security. We've got to create order against the Reds and the Bolsheviks and the conniving Jews. And then they bring in new levels of order. So this is a very good man in that, very flexible figure. Also because he was structurally dependent on the hierarchy not having estates or not being able to stack away lots and lots of money. He sort of works by being an interstitial figure in this regime. Very important for that reason.
Mm-hmm. And there's just, readers there's so much rich detail about these kinds of contradictions where you had to be, a macho leader, but you couldn't be too prominent. You couldn't be the fastest way to get demoted was to be too competent or too popular, as Italo Balbo found out. And there's a wonderful detail about Mussolini asking all of his high officials to shave their beards. And Balbo did not, but Teruzzi did. So these kinds of small humiliations which were built into the model. So I also wanted to ask you about morality, because that's part of the subtitle of the book. And you mentioned it's a study of, quote, moral life under fascist rule, and that militiamen and others had their own moral code. And it wasn't a moral code that was necessarily conventional. So many people don't think of fascists as having, as being particularly moral, since they're constantly killing people and being lawless in many, many ways. So can you talk more about how this fascist morality, what it consisted of, and how somebody like Teruzzi reconciled this rectitude of being a military figure Because in theory, in the military, you were faithful to the king. The king was the commander-in-chief. That was a particularity of the Italian case. So, and yet the militia was very lawless. The militia was really, there were a lot of thugs in the militia. So how does this, each individual obviously found their own way of negotiating this, but what's your sense of this kind of fascist morality?
Well, I mean, this is a movement which, because its lack of, its programmatic opportunism and very rapid growth, the fact that it was exceptionally violent, young men coming back from the war, then engaging in what was in effect a civil war, where they had no difficulty saying it was the Reds who were the new enemy. They're not even an internal enemy, they were like an external enemy. They were Bolsheviks in Russia, and now they had infected the troops and the veterans at home and the peasants, and so now the battle was from the front back to the internal enemy, to seize the state, get rid of these geriatric, the swamp, drain the swamp, get rid of the geriatric old male elites who were impotent, shit-eaters, this word kagoya, which D'Annunzio invented to call one of the great liberal statesmen. And so, they could justify that violence in the sort of war sense. At the same time, it was much more complicated because there was a very strong sort of vulgar Nietzschean quality. We hate women who are sentimental. We hate socialists who are reformists and pathetic. Judeo-Christian guilt, that's not our thing. We're going to move beyond that. And, we, by virtue of us being heroic and having a mission, which is God's mission, we're crusaders and so on. There's a big mishmash of stuff. Now, Teruzzi was very secular. He was a Milanese. Basically, he had very petty bourgeois notions. I mean, he's going to marry a wife who's a virgin. What a crazy idea. He's going to separate from her because she somehow betrayed him. There's a lot, he's very conventional. So in fact, he has quite a lot of trouble always justifying his misdeeds. He's always trying to kind of cover up. He's not as, in terms of corruption, he's relatively limited. He does the little stuff that gets him caught out, like cheating. Cheating on women, hanging out with a gang of guys, appointing his cousins to become militia consuls, that sort of thing, but an extremely hard worker. So he's always following the bureaucratic rules, enormous prolix reports, which then are also cover-ups because they keep going. And then in the end, when these people are asked at their trials, did you do anything wrong? And they said, no, if I did something wrong, then the kings did something wrong. I just served the king in the king's wars. Or, I just governed. I was a minister. I was legally appointed by a legal government, which was a fascist government. And, and it was very hard then to nail them on many questions, but a figure like that, came away and say, I just did my duty.
Yeah. The eternal rationale, and Teruzzi ended up in prison, which many of his colleagues did not. At one point, you say something so interesting when you're sizing up his career trajectory of, again, somebody who pivoted from this kind of military rectitude to this, fascist militia lawlessness. And you say that he and this was someone who followed Mussolini to the end. He chose to, when Italy surrendered to the Allies and Italy kind of split, and there was the Hitler-supported Republic of Salo. That was a real moment of decision for Italians in the service of the regime. They had to decide whether to follow Mussolini to the north, and then you were, it was a Nazi puppet state. Some did, some didn't, but he did. And you say at the end of the book that he, in doing this, it was a reflection of a, quote, profound lack of imagination as to life's alternatives. And this struck me because, you know, we have a 20-year regime, and this is what authoritarian regimes want us. They want to impoverish our souls and impoverish our, and close down our horizons, so we can't really imagine anything beyond the regime, even if they're lucky enough to travel or be sophisticated and have partners like he did, these women who are part of different worlds. So when did you write this with a sense of lessons from a life under fascism that can travel to other contexts? Are there lessons in this experience that you think can apply today when we have so many collaborators of so many illiberal regimes?
Let me think for a moment about the argument about he had a profound lack of imagination. There was still a very strong moral drive among those following Mussolini that, yes, the country was occupied by the Nazis. Now they had the duty to defend it from the worst depredations of the Nazis. And in any case, far and away, the worst problem was that the Americans and the British, by combining together with the Soviets, were opening European civilization to Judeo-Bolshevism. And the next stop was going to be the invasion by the Red Army of Europe. This thanks to this troglodyte, hypocritical British Empire and the Jew-ridden, conniving capitalist Roosevelt. So that's a moral stand. You may disagree with it, but Teruzzi was very convinced of that the British were hypocritical plutocrats, and that Italy was the striving proletariat. And I think if we don't understand the more general logic of defending your country to the end, we can't understand, you know, what this Republic of Salo, this last gasp. They were saying the king was a traitor. Badoglio, the new prime minister, had sold out the country to the Americans, and they were going to go into the hills and fight to the very end, hoping that Hitler proved a friend, which turned out not to be a friend. He betrayed them as well, that he would get his bomb in order and bomb the British, and that would somehow save Europe from the Soviets. It was a very, you know, cockeyed, as you can imagine, hysterical, infantile thinking. I don't think we can call it immoral, though. I think that, you know, our historians now studying the morality of the resistance say, you know, these are terrible conflicts over moral stances, and that's what makes civil war so terrible, that, you know, they think, in this case, the fascists think they still have right on their side, that they're the true heirs. But anyway, that said, morality, I don't think you can do battles on politics over moral issues. I think that one of the sort of, maybe people, I hope people will get this out of this book, that, you know, all the sleaziness of these men, you know, but good men and bad men, the best so-called fascists, they have lovers and this and that. Teruzzi is the guy, you know, who he puts his hands all over you, and then he gives lots of gifts to women, and he promotes women a lot. He was famous for promoting women all the time. He was probably one of the leading benefactors of young women in the colonies, get them licenses to run cinemas, do this, do that, secretaries, and so on and so forth. So, you know, this is a sort of Berlusconi type figure who has, and lots of young women were writing to him, even in their affairs, asking them to do this and that for their brothers or fathers and so on and so forth. So there is always this kind of mercenary contractual trade-off. So he's very, very sleazy and so on. But I will argue in the book again and again, we can't judge him on that, on that he's immoral. I mean, look at all the so-called immorality, but that's slave logic. Oh, bad behavior, oh, naughty this. That, frankly, to me is Me Too behavior, which is very courageous, involves denunciations, but that's not about bringing down whole fascist political system who's causing wars, bringing down the whole international system. That's a different level, if you want, of deception and immorality, when you betray your people, when you kill other peoples, when you create a whole system where the weak are deeply penalized by the illegality. So in that sense, I don't want my book to encourage American moralizing. We moralize about everything. And the most important thing is to get our minds straight and talk about the politics of it, the inequality and the political corruption and the despotism of and illegality of political behavior. And that's different from that's the moral question with moral with a big M. And that's what I'm interested here, in moral order in a larger sense.
Yeah, no, you do it. And this mentioning that he was a patron to so many women, including helping them get economic start, is really important. That's typical of the complexity of your work and its value. And I think that anybody reading the book will have a much better sense through this man and his world of why fascism appealed to so many different kinds of people. And that is, of course, a question that people find very relevant today. I guess the last thing I'd ask you about is virility. At one point you say that it was key, at the beginning of the book, it was key to the operation of fascist despotism. And I found in doing my research for my Strongmen book that it was masculinity and virility so important that I elevated it to a major tool of rule of authoritarianism alongside propaganda and corruption. So how do you want to unpack what we mean by a fascist virility for the audience?
Well, it is you're right, it's a kind of a super category. And in some ways it comes down to a very archaic notion of virility, because women could also be virile. So it's sort of a combination of forces which set some humans above others in the Darwinian pecking order. And it means that they are, in some sense, more creative, more fertile, more capable of ruling, and therefore they should be destined to lead wherever everybody's going. And it's certainly, it's interesting that you'd say, well, you could find it over time. I think probably every national culture, or even every time period, has its own notion of what is meant by virility, because it was possible, like a Hitler, to be very virile and then have one ball or no balls. I mean, or certainly no children. No obvious conjugal life in an accepted heterosexual way. And at the same time, clearly Mussolini, with his 5 children and his many lovers, was considered no more virile. The Italians would say, well, we are more than the Germans, but on the other hand, the Germans had much bigger uniforms and a much stronger empire and an amazing military, and they saluted them in a very attractive way. So, you get into a kind of enormous or imperial pissing contest amongst these dictators. And so it does become a key even in high politics and diplomatic politics in the end. I have no doubt I could see that, and I could see how Teruzzi is caught too, admiring enormously these Germans, very worried about what some call Mussolini's sexual senility, as he got a younger girlfriend and seemed to be spending more time in the boudoir and less interested in domination than he had been. So it's an interesting problem to tease it out and to see how it operates as a historical category.
Definitely. Do we want to take some questions from, is Nell coming in to?
Seems to be there, waiting by the side. I should say, be all of that again. The perfect fascist. We have to think of it in a paradoxical way, because that oftentimes too, and historians start talking, well, he was a good fascist like Italo Balbo because he was impertinent toward Mussolini and he was philo-Jewish. But good gracious, I mean, the atrocities he committed, before he was a major military figure, or the very famous case of Bottai, who was regarded as the most intelligent, jurist. He did the Education Acts, but he was the one who said, well, we've better push those anti-Semitic laws through before the schools open. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of sob sister Italians worrying about the Jews being expelled the week after school starts. So, is that the good fascists and the bad fascists? It becomes very paradoxical because we're talking about a system where they all feed off of one another, and the leader plays them against one another and needs them. It doesn't exist without this circle, who stay on over a long time. There's a lot of continuity in the personnel, lots and lots.
Well, if we do have some great questions here, if you would like to take some. So first, I'll kind of go backwards a bit. So first, in the course of working on the book, did you meet anyone who knew Teruzzi, even at the end of his life, e.g. anyone connected with the prison he spent most of the end of his life in, for example?
Well, yes, I was very lucky that I was going to go to the prison, which was on the island of Procida. And I would always dream, wouldn't it be amazing, speak to his confessor. That was a sort of one of these ideas. And I met a printer in Naples who was from Procida, and the priest was still alive. The old priest who had, taken care of Teruzzi's funeral, and he was 95 years old, laid out in this glorious view of Capri with his Russian nurse, beautiful uniform, James Bond type figure. And he repeated things, that he had a bad temper. He had written in a memoir some words about him, he spoke very kindly about his companion, his woman companion. And that takes a big effort for the priest to recognize his non-married companion as being a very good woman. So that was a very, very interesting, small piece. I was very helped by his granddaughter who knew nothing about him, zero. He had died, and her mother never spoke about him. I was helped by old partisans who knew people who had participated in the shootout when they caught him fleeing in 1945. So there was always a sort of one removed. Italy is a smaller society, so you got this sort of one removed very often. It turned out the priest, the 95-year-old priest, was the only one who knew him, and who knew him intimately as well. So,
man, let's see if I can condense this sort of a two-parter. So essentially the question is, why do you think Liliana didn't agree to the annulment? And also Liliana is sometimes referred to as a countess, but Attilio was not a count, he was a general. Is that her correct title?
Oh, sweet. Read the book, folks. Well, a lot of people give themselves airs, and countess, there's a kind of a history of the use of the term contessa, which is associated with a lot of power in a kind of melodramatic way. The melodrama of the countess behind the scenes, scheming, and then certain society, expat society, being a countess, gave you entree into certain things, but he was never knighted or given any such thing by the king. And the other question, why did she resist? Well, she resisted for lots of reasons, and they changed over time. And that's very worth thinking about, the kinds of what motivates people to resist when they've been terribly wronged. Mm. So again, I would urge readers to think about that. There's both a moral and a political story, feminist and of a woman wronged, and it works out over a long time, and it's fascinating. She's a fascinating figure. Mm-hmm. It sometimes at one point or so it broke my heart that I could see it couldn't be about her, but I didn't want to write Henry James, ingenue, and Edith Wharton, the young maiden who goes off and marries the cad. That was not, couldn't be about that.
It is pretty Jamesian. That hadn't, but yeah. We have a question. This is kind of a broader question, but did fascism and the goals of Mussolini have a different hold on different regions of Italy? Sort of depending on especially depending on the degree to which the regions benefited from colonialism or were committed to colonialism.
Well, I'd love to ask our audience, where do you think the fascists came from? And probably, they'd say like Sicily or Naples, or, must be related to the Camorra or to the mafia. No, folks, Milan, Milan and the richest area, Lombardy. So the place where there was the most capitalism, the most class struggle, the most polarization, the most men who would go over to this new far right to be able to organize the power of these leagues and associations. It's almost the exact same place that today generates the Lega, the same province, provinces around Milan, exactly, and some of the same physical types as well are very much. You could say there's a type that comes from the area around Cremona. Seems to, something in the water there that over the 1920s, and it was an area first of a very strong socialism, and then fascism, and then strong communism, and then it flipped over in the 1990s to this new rightism. So it's kind of an interesting flipping back and forth. So that I think you want to keep in mind. Milan, Lombardy, the whole Po, everywhere there was class conflict. You can draw a map, and I have some beautiful maps in the book, very hard to draw, elegantly done, about Italian fascists at war and the March on Rome and mapping. But you can sort of, in retrospect, there's not been good maps on it. Everywhere there was big class conflict, and the bourgeoisie was really worried you get the squadrism. So all along the north, around Syracuse in the south, around Apulia, beautiful Apulia, in the heel of the boot. That's where it is, and the rest comes after mainly. After the Rome. So,
and we have an interesting kind of a parallelism question. Someone asks, do you see fascist morality as similar to the Christian fundamentalism that supports Trump?
There was a big streak in that morality. They had something called clerical fascism, a kind of fundamentalism, which the church really does begin a kind of counter-reformation. It's the moment where the Pope declares that marriage is the most important sacrament because it's combining with the body of God. It's a theological argument, and therefore, if the state touches the body of humans who are in the likeness of God, that is a perversion and a sin. So no eugenics, no like the Nazis, no abortion, no divorce, and so on. It was a very important movement. The church was under a lot of stress from Protestantism, from Americanism, from Bolshevism in that period. The Jews were the least of their problems. And so it's a very strong movement. You can see it. Everybody's touched by it. Mussolini remarries in the church in, I think, 1924, and his kids are all baptized. Teruzzi was certainly anti-clerical. And he, becomes involved. So they all become very Catholic in the 1930s, all of them. And then they lose it quickly, unless they're caught and put in prison like Teruzzi. And then the church is very important. Salvation in prison.
I think we'll make this the last question. Again, kind of a broader one. I think this would be great for both of you. From that extensive psychographical profiling of Teruzzi, what can we learn about dealing with modern strongmen? Do moral arguments ever work? What should we, the demos, hope for? How to tame them?
Well, I'll give one answer, and then Ruth, you go first, and then let me answer differently. I think we'll answer differently, but maybe not.
So the kind of strongmen ruler they have in common, and unfortunately, they have very similar personalities, from Mussolini up to people who may be ruling today, including in America. And those personalities are essentially possessed of a Darwinian, survivalist, totally amoral sense of life. They think in the aggregate. They don't really care. People get upset when I do interviews about Trump and coronavirus, and I say that Trump really doesn't care if you live or die. And his niece Mary Trump echoed this in her book. But it's a bleak, calculated kind of mentality, and so moral arguments of a conventional type don't work with them. And I'll turn the rest over to Victoria.
I'm very suspicious of the moral critique, unless it's a very big moral critique, which says we have to move beyond what's present. If these new despotisms are emerging very differently from the 1920s, from the 1990s, and then again from 1915 on, it's because of major crisis in the political system, the political system's incapacity to deal with the most fundamental questions of fate, whether it's the climate, whether it's inequality, whether it's this mad hatter crony capitalism, COVID, part of it, connected. These apocalypses go together, war, pandemic, famine, and economic crisis. And so the problem is not to get stuck on the immorality or the peccadillos, because everybody's got something. I mean, you've got some spectrum on the personality, but to create the kind of new political movement that so far moves beyond on the moral level, because it's a new kind of politics. And that's why, in some ways I find, Ruth, you more pessimistic because you're dealing with personality types. And I like to think, well, my God, look at the energy coming out of Black Lives Matter. And historically, that's been true in the US. It's been, Black movement's been enormously energizing in civil affairs. So we now have and that this is then about a movement. So, it's like the Popular Front, which eventually, very eventually, God knows, in 1941 on, win the war, because the Soviet Union's willing to get out of its terrible, despotic innerness. United States breaks out of its isolationism. The church says, finally, we're believing human rights for not just for Christians, but for everybody. The Churchill is willing to negotiate some changes, maybe to get rid of the empire. And that kind of coalescing allows for the huge new that has to come. Because if we just sit still back and critique the moral peccadillos, I really feel like, we're like Nietzsche's slaves. It's like this going over and over, a kind of, we're moral slaves, and we don't, understand, the enormous effort of psychological and social and moral that we have to move forward. But that's rather abstract, and onto the barricades, everybody.
Right. On job. Well, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. And thank you everyone at home for joining us. Again, if you would head over to the link that I posted in the chat to purchase a copy of this remarkable book. And again, I'm beaming in from Nashville, and thank you again to both of you, and stay safe, everyone. Be well, and thank you, you both. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Bye.
Bye.